Today, we're going to talk about two of my favorite things, a Hamilton and Indiana Jones. Because today, we're going to check out the Hamilton Indy, or better known as the American classic Boulton, the watch that was featured in the latest Indiana Jones film, The Dial of Destiny. However, and spoiler alert, this one probably would have been better off in the Crystal Skull than the latest film. And it's also summer here in Texas and hotter than hell outside, so jacket's coming off. Anyway, back to the watch. Now, the Dial of Destiny isn't bad. I went in with some pretty low expectations, but it was better than I thought it was going to be. But the Crystal Skull, like this watch, has some really good parts, only to be ruined by a couple of really frustrating bits. And in the end, you're left just confused and frustrated and just asking why, as it really doesn't make any logical sense. I probably should have done some more research on this one before buying it, but as a big Hamilton and a big Indiana fan, I was immediately interested in this one when I heard about it, if for no other reason than to do a video on it. And I at least waited until Jomashop had some slightly better prices before ordering one, because MSRP here is a little nuts. I mean, it is a Hamilton. And before we really get to the nitty-gritty, there is some background I think you need to know about this one. And especially for those who are looking at it and just thinking it's another tank homage, because it's not quite. You see, the Boulton is actually a refresh of a watch Hamilton started making way back in the 40s. So back then, you might have considered it an homage, but after 80 years, I think it's got enough history of its own. And a couple of years ago, they actually brought it back with two new versions. You have a mechanical version and a smaller small-second quartz version. Both good-looking Art Deco tank watches with Roman numerals. And until a few days ago, when I actually started putting this review together, I thought this version, the Indy version, was just a special version of that small seconds, but it's not. Checking out the specs, this Indy version is slightly larger, as well as having a few key differences, and that's going to be important later. I also want to point out right away that this god-awful, ugly crocodile strap is the one that comes with the watch. It's a typical Hamilton strap, which means it's overall okay, a bit stiff, and also just ugly. And for me in particular, this strap really doesn't say Indiana Jones. I just don't see it. So I took it off almost immediately and replaced it with this one, just a straight classic Horween strap. But I want to point it out now just to avoid any confusion, because you're going to see it more on that other strap I bought than the one it comes with. Anyway, let's do this one Crystal Skull style, which means I'm going to start off with the specs, tell you what's great about it, and then I'm going to completely ruin it for you. Now, this square beauty has a stainless steel case with a yellow gold PVD coating. It's 27 millimeters wide with a 41.6 millimeter lug-to-lug, while total thickness, or rather slimness, is sitting at 7.8 millimeters, which includes a snap-on case back and a really cool domed crystal. Mineral crystal. Mineral. We'll get to that. It's also extremely lightweight at around 32 grams on its strap, while water resistance is a paltry 30 meters. I mean, it is a dress watch after all. And it's all powered by an ETA 980.163 caliber quartz movement. So you can already see that there's some good and some bad with this one. But one of the best things about it is just how the watch wears. It's hands down one of the most comfortable watches I've ever worn. I mean, with those sleek dimensions and as slim and as lightweight as this case is, you would expect that. But the Boulton also has another trick up its sleeve, as the case, as well as the case back, has a very subtle curvature to it, which looks absolutely amazing from the side, and especially where the curvature of the case meets the crystal. But more importantly, the curved case back just seemed to naturally match the curvature of my 7¼ inch wrist. Now, I'm not typically a fan of gold flashy watches, and I would have preferred it if this was in steel. But I gotta admit, I absolutely love wearing this thing. Not just because it's so comfortable, but also because it's a cool, gorgeous looking watch. Square or tank style watches are always interesting. In the world of watches, they are a bit more uncommon, and they always seem to be a throwback to a bygone era. There's just this retro or vintage styling to them. One they usually fully embrace, which is what Hamilton did with the other versions of the Boulton, by employing stretched out Roman numerals, going full Art Deco. Whereas with the Indy, they use normal looking Arabics, which I think gives it a little bit more of a casual look, and maybe slightly more modern. Slightly, because it is still very gold and done in a vintage style font, as well as a more classic looking Hamilton logo at the top. But by not stretching out the indices or moving them more towards the center, they wound up giving the watch a more open and cleaner feel than the regular Boultons, letting you appreciate the off-white, slightly silvery nature of the dial, as well as that small second hand, as it has a bit more room to breathe around it. The indices also appear to be applied, or at least raised. They aren't very tall, but I think they're just tall enough to give the watch a little bit of depth, which is further magnified by the crystal at times. Like I said, I'm not a fan of flashy gold watches, and I realize I'm saying that while wearing a champagne khaki king, but typically I'm not. There is just something about this one that I love. It's a great looking, extremely comfortable watch, and I think I vastly prefer this dial to the regular Boultons. So if I love how this one looks and I love how it wears, how could Hamilton screw it up? Well, I think you already know the answer to that. And the answer is in the specs. If you're a regular viewer, you know I'm not someone who judges a watch purely on specs. But there's some extremely stupid stuff here, starting with the price. MSRP is 695 Swiss francs, or about $800 US, which just seems stupidly high for what you're getting here. But remember, this is a Hamilton, so prices will fluctuate and be a bit less on the gray market, and I paid almost half of that. Although, one thing that's also obvious and probably should be mentioned is that this is a bit of a cash grab by saying that it's featured in the latest Indiana Jones film, because that's kind of stretching it. Now, this isn't one that's in any other Indy film, and if you're looking for the watch in the Dial of Destiny, you will catch some glimpses of it. But I don't think there's a single scene in the entire movie where you get a nice clean look at it. So this one is definitely not a must-have for Indy fans, or even anywhere remotely near like the Murph watch from Interstellar. It's nowhere near vital to the plot. It's more just an interesting bit of trivia about this particular model, and that's about it. Now, for the price, I think it goes without saying that a mechanical movement would have been nice. And there is a mechanical version out there for a little bit more. But overall here, I am okay with Quartz. And I think it makes sense for what they were trying to do. Create a smaller, thinner watch that's more accessible to everyone. Remember, regular people don't obsess over movements like us watch geeks. There's also that paltry 30 meters of water resistance. While low and disappointing, I think it is acceptable for a dress watch. And let's not forget that case back. Snap-on. Why did it have to be a snap-on? Indy quotes aside, if you're a regular viewer, you know I hate snap-on case backs with a passion. And especially on a Quartz watch that you're going to need to change the battery every couple of years. At best, things always get scratched. Now, I could almost excuse it here, because if you're going for a more authentic design, it does make some sense. But I also look at that beautiful curvature of the case and crystal, and I can't help but feel that this is just a recipe for disaster, as sometimes you need to put a bit of pressure on that case back to get it back in. And here, all that pressure is going to be focused at the very tip of that domed crystal. And I can just hear that crack now. So for me, this is one I would definitely take to a dealer to have the battery changed. I just don't want to deal with it. And I gotta ask, how much harder would it have been to just secure this with 4 small screws? Heck, Shinola does it. It can't be that hard. And speaking of the crystal, mineral crystal. Yeah, I don't get it either. I mean, if you're gonna go vintage, polymer might make more sense. And maybe sapphire is really hard to work with when you're trying to get this shape. But still, $800 MSRP for a watch with mineral crystal? Come on. So it's kind of a mixed bag here. Great design, extremely comfortable on the wrist, but pretty shaky specs. And individually, I think each of those things by themselves is potentially excusable, not necessarily a deal killer. But all of them in the same watch, and I think it starts to become a problem. And for me in particular, the battery and the crystal, I worry about how this thing's going to fare in 4 or 5 years, let alone in the long run. However, we're not done yet. And where things get really frustrating, the kick in the pants, so to speak, is when you compare this one to the regular small second Boulton. Remember, I said that was going to be important. Now, the regular version is a little smaller. Specs say it's 23.5 by 27.5 with a thickness of 8.5 millimeters. And that's compared to the 27 by 31.5 with a 7.8 millimeter thickness of the Indy. And that's their official specs, not my measurements. So it is a little bit smaller, as well as $60 cheaper. But here's the kicker. When you look at the specs, you got 50 meters of water resistance, a sapphire crystal, and after a little bit of digging, I eventually found a picture of its case back. See that? 4 small screws. So yeah, I just don't get it. I mean, the things that I think are a problem, the things that I'm worried about in the long run, and the things that I know watch enthusiasts are going to have issues with, these are things that were obviously already thought about when they put together the original re-release. And back then, they decided they were bad ideas and should go a different route. Now, the Boulton isn't very popular, but I've read some pretty glowing reviews from current owners. They say that if you're good with quartz, it's a fantastic tank alternative. So Hamilton already had that. They had a recipe for fortune and glory. And all they had to do was give that watch a different paint job, put in a different dial, and bam, you got a great watch with a movie connection. But no, they decided to re-engineer failure from the ground up. And that's why I'm saying this watch is more like the Crystal Skull. You know they knew what they were doing. They obviously had a recipe for success. And for some reason, at the last minute, they decided to completely ignore all of that and cast Shia LaBeouf. It's frustrating, and really, it just blows my mind. And the only reason I can think that this happened is that maybe the chief designer got back from a trip from Amsterdam before he started working on it. Because otherwise, I just don't get it. Bottom line, it's a watch that I really, really want to love. But for this one, there's no time for love, Dr. Jones. It's not one I can recommend, because I just can't think of any reason to justify spending this much with those shaky specs. Unless the gray market really comes down in price. I mean, $300, I can see that. But at $500, let alone $800, it doesn't seem like a watch that will last and justify that much. And honestly, I didn't do my research before buying this one. Otherwise, I might not have. I just saw Indy, I saw Hamilton, and a good looking watch, and I didn't think twice. I honestly never thought Hamilton would have goofed up this much. But sometimes that's just part of being a reviewer. You get to be the one to figure this stuff out, and it's your job to spread the word. That said, the regular Boulton, the mechanical and the regular small seconds, that actually might be worth checking out. And after I sell this one, perhaps I will. Hamilton, you lost today, but that doesn't mean you need to like it. As for everyone else, let me know what you think down below. Do you agree with me, or am I just being way too picky? And as always, do something down below, like, comment, subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.